Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us. We have, as of now, 189 participants, which is a record, and the number continues increasing. On behalf of UNICEF's Evaluation Office and of EVALSDGs, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar entitled Better Criteria for Better Evaluation, and that will be delivered by Megan Kennedy-Chouane on behalf of the OECD DAC. We have some quick announcements, so no presentation visible. Please do not get desperate. We are just starting the webinar. You will see the presentation when the presentation starts. Yes, Lotte, we will start the presentation soon. Please bear with us. We are just in the introduction. I just want to please listen to some important announcements. The presentation will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with you as soon as we can, in a few days from now, through the all list servers, and it will be also posted in the EVALSDGs website. The webinar will be moderated by Kasem El-Sadiq. Kasem El-Sadiq is the vice chair of EVALSDGs, one of the organizers of this webinar. Kasem is an international expert in program monitoring and evaluation. He has led, facilitated, and consulted for various assignments in the Middle East and North Africa MENA region. Kasem is credited for his civic engagement and expertise that relates to the civil society dynamics within the development and environment agenda. Kasem is pursuing his PhD in public policy evaluation at Carleton University, Canada. Kasem is member of the board of the MENA Evaluation Network, EVAL-MENA, and he is currently vice chair of EVALSDGs, which, as I mentioned before, is a co-organizer of this event, this webinar. Kasem, over to you. Kasem will kindly introduce the presenter. Over to you, Kasem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ada. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, colleagues all over the globe. I'm delighted and happy to moderate this webinar, and I'm delighted also to introduce our speaker for today. Megan Kennedy-Chouane is the head of the evaluation unit in the Development Cooperation Directorate at OECD. And she has led the evaluation team at OECD. She has an academic background in economics, peace studies, and public administration, with a major focus on children and youth. And she brings an expertise, huge expertise in the use of evidence in public policy making to reduce poverty and support social justice. Megan will provide in this webinar an overview of the conclusions drawn from the last 2 years of consultation, global consultation process on the review of the OECD DAC criteria. She will share the definitions as well as provide some insights on the principles behind them. And we're very much excited to have her among us today. The discussion it resonates with a lot of those practitioners, commissioners, all of those people who are engaged in the evaluation community. So quickly, I wanted to welcome Megan on board. She will be presenting for like 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll take a Q&A session, a quick Q&A session for another 10 minutes, and then she will resume second part of the presentation, digging deep into key criteria that she will explore further, and then we open the floor for quite an extensive amount of time to discuss and share insights, and we'll be closing hopefully in like an hour 15 minutes from now. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Katham, and thank you, Ada. I'm delighted to have such a platform and an opportunity to discuss with all of you. And I will begin sharing the PowerPoints now. Just one moment. So I'm sharing the PowerPoints now. Hopefully that should appear on your screens in just a moment. I also would like to mention that the documents providing additional information on the criteria and the definitions is available on our website at oe.cd/criteria, oe.cd/criteria, and they're available both in English and in French. So today's presentation, I will give you a bit of background on the process and on the evaluation network, but we will mainly spend most of our time, as Katham mentioned, exploring the definitions and the contents. And as I'm covering quite a bit of information, I do invite you to jot down your questions, and the moderator, Katham, and our colleagues at UNICEF will be gathering all of those questions. So if we don't have time to get to your question today, we can also continue to explore those. And I start with this title, Better Criteria for Better Evaluation, because in speaking to all of you in the global evaluation community, I think it's important to keep our mind on our ultimate goal, which is to strengthen the role of evaluation in supporting sustainable development around the world. And we view this project on the criteria very much in that light. I'm coming from the OECD, where I manage the DAC Network on Development Evaluation, which is part of the Development Assistance Committee and made up of the independent and central evaluation units of the OECD countries and many of our multilateral partners and United Nations partners as well. The network is a platform for learning. We work to strengthen evaluation capacities and systems. We also support decision-making and improving the effectiveness of public policies and interventions by taking evaluation evidence and sharing that evidence, both producing more evidence and communicating the findings of evaluation. And we work with our members to improve the quality of evaluations and to strengthen coordination and collaboration by addressing methodological challenges. In that last area, we have developed a number of standards and guidance in the field of evaluation, of which the evaluation criteria are one, but by no means the only area of norms and standards. And so a key message that I wanted to share with you today is that these criteria should really be understood within a broader context of what counts, what makes a good evaluation. And so just to draw your attention to some of our other key norms and standards, the principles for evaluation and the evaluation quality standards, which both highlight a number of important issues around participation, cooperation, the involvement of partners, and the coverage of ethical standards in evaluation, as well as transparency and credibility of evaluation processes. So flagging that these documents are, in particular the principles, perhaps the language is a bit outdated. They're actually even older than the evaluation quality standards. But I think many of these core principles are really still key to the field of evaluation. Where we're coming from within the OECD DAC is that we view evaluation playing a critical role in achieving sustainable development. It's our understanding that Agenda 2030 and the Paris Climate Agreement both have an urgent learning imperative. And what we mean by that is that we need to know what works for whom and why and under what circumstances. We need to learn much more quickly, and we need to implement best practices and scale them up much more quickly, given the urgency of the climate crisis and the ambition of the global agenda with the SDGs. In order to produce this evidence, we think we need both more and better evaluation. And that includes asking the right questions in those evaluations, which is where the criteria fit. What are the criteria? The criteria were first laid out by the OECD Development Assistance Committee in 1991. So they've been around for almost 30 years. And they were defined in the 2002 Glossary of Key Terms in Evaluation and Results-Based Management. Now, the criteria are widely known, and the terms are used extensively throughout development cooperation and beyond. But I think we sometimes lose sight of the purpose and the importance of these criteria. When they first emerged, they brought about a new focus on effectiveness and results. Whereas previously there was a lot of discussion in the international community and within the DAC around inputs, how much money is being spent, and on activities, what types of activities, training, capacity building, infrastructure projects, what things were being funded. The criteria tried to raise the bar in terms of understanding efficiency, relevance, effectiveness, impact, and sustainability, and really formed the core basis of what later became the Aid Effectiveness Agenda. As I mentioned, though they were originally developed for use in development cooperation and originally developed by donors, they are now even more widely used and referenced. We have colleagues from within NATO in the military that have used the criteria. We also know that they're used in many national and subnational contexts for domestic evaluation, in a domestic policy evaluation context. And this has really been driven by demand. So the OECD DAC members are in some way mandated to use the criteria. It's a requirement that they do evaluations and that they base their evaluations on the EVALNet core standards, including the criteria. But others who are not obliged to use the criteria are also using them. And we think that's an important indication of the strength and the value of the criteria and of their uptake that illustrates that. So why adapt these criteria? The first main motivator really comes from within the international evaluation community, where we see that over the years there have been a number of challenges with using the criteria, but there have also been a number of lessons learned about the right ways to go about applying these criteria. And there was a need to consolidate that learning and to help support continued improvement in evaluation through the use of the criteria. It goes without saying that the development landscape has changed significantly since 1991, so it merited a revisit. And finally, in a formal sense, we received a request from the OECD Development Assistance Committee at the ministerial level in their 2017 meeting. So that was the immediate impetus for this work. The evaluation network took on this challenge, and we proceeded in a nearly 2-year process to conduct a global consultation that lasted throughout 2018 and into 2019. This included interviews with key stakeholders and external experts. We hosted a consultation workshop here in Paris in March of 2018. We then proceeded to engage with a much broader range of partners through international meetings and seminars in Asia, Africa, and Europe, as well as engaging with our partners and counterparts in the evaluation units of United Nations Evaluation Group and the Evaluation Cooperation Group with the multilateral partners. We conducted a survey of our own members, the evaluation units of OECD members, and we also conducted a public survey. The findings and much more detail and information about the responses to the public survey and the other aspects of our consultation are available on our website. I won't go into too much more detail on that, but you're welcome to explore that on the web. This shows you an outline of the process. The drafting began in the beginning of 2019, and we had feedback from our membership and also from external partners on multiple drafts, which were then revised through a series of webinars. And finally, the evaluation network approved the final document, the final definitions, in November, and they were endorsed by the DAC in December. We're now working to develop a guidance, which I will tell you more about in just a moment. And so the work is very much ongoing in supporting these criteria and their rollout. So what did we find in the consultation? First, there was very broad agreement on the value add of the criteria. They've become a core principle, a core pillar of international evaluation practice. In particular, they were praised for their simplicity. The fact that these concepts are quite clear and easily understood, including beyond the evaluation community. At the same time, there is certainly a number of areas where there was a need for clarification. And most importantly, perhaps what we heard over and over again in the consultation was that many of the challenges and weaknesses of the criteria had to do with how they were being applied. And in particular, the tendency for the criteria to be applied in a blanket way, mechanistically, and to be made mandatory or sort of a checkbox approach as they were institutionalized within different organizations and governments. So this was quite interesting for us because we then shifted our focus to also looking at how the criteria are used and applied. I'd like to share a couple of reflections on this consultation process with you from our own perspective within the Secretariat before we open it up for questions. The first is that it was quite clear the huge importance that these criteria have within the global evaluation community. And to be quite honest, we were a little bit surprised by the level of response to this consultation and by the passion that was brought by yourselves and many others to the topic of these criteria. We heard many ranging viewpoints, and I think it was quite exciting and interesting to see this level of interest from our colleagues. At the same time, a lot of the feedback we received went well beyond the criteria and even beyond evaluation. So just to give you one example, often we've heard critiques of the criteria relevance. And in those critiques, we hear, for example, about donor-funded projects that are implemented in a community without proper consultation and without local ownership. Now, that could be viewed as an example of an irrelevant intervention because it's not sufficiently based on local needs and priorities. I think that does not mean that the criteria of relevance itself is not a useful lens through which to view that intervention. So we've had a challenge of balancing those critiques and also trying to understand them, and also hearing a lot about the general state of development cooperation, including continued lack of coordination from donors, the lack of country alignment and ownership. And these are all important issues that we are now looking at how we can address going beyond the criteria. It's also been a challenge for us in that light to manage expectations. And when we started the work on the definitions themselves, really focusing on that content and avoiding trying to overload these criteria with the expectations that they can transform the broader development or the broader public sector accountability space. So while we recognize their importance, we also think it's useful to be realistic about their limitations. These are very much a first step in the direction of improving evaluation and supporting its use. And we hope that they are taken and used in ways that others find useful, and we hope they're taken in that light. Within the evaluation network, I would also like to mention that we are now developing a work plan to address some of the other key issues, in particular the evaluation of gender equality and women's empowerment, both for targeted and mainstreamed approaches. And we are also working on issues of coordination, capacity development, and evaluating blended finance and private finance areas, just to give a couple of highlights of our planned work. So I'd love to hear more from you before we go into the criteria.
Thank you, Megan, for the insights and the description and the presentation of the process and the key learnings that you've drawn throughout the process. I'd like to open the floor for quick reactions. We're going to spend like 5 minutes, probably, if there is any burning clarification, reaction, or question from the floor. Meanwhile, I'll be looking at the sidebar and probably compiling a couple of questions for you to address them at a time. So we have two way of phrasing the question. Either you can, the participants can probably jot down the question or clarification on the sidebar, or they can immediately ask to for a quick question verbally if you like doing so.
Kasem, let's start with the sidebar, please.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Probably we have 3 questions. I'm gonna go through them at a time. What about evaluating the advocacy progress as an area of focus? Another question: does OECD develop tools to do a better use of the conclusions of evaluations? Somebody's questioning the overloading. What do you mean by avoid overloading? It's scrolling fast. I can't chase that. In considering the input, Megan, did you respond to majority input as priority or consider all input and analyze them. So what's the approach? Did you look at where the majority of the inputs are coming from and the areas of concern? Leroy is saying 1/5 of the contributions of the stakeholder consultation were independent consultation. Isn't that a bias? That's on the. So let me try to probably compile a couple of questions at a time.
Great. Shall I start on a few of those, and then if I miss any, Kassem, maybe you can redirect me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. So the first question on advocacy, I'll speak in just a moment about how the criteria are intended to be used. And yes, they are useful and have been used widely for evaluating advocacy-related interventions. In terms of how did we arbitrate the input that we got, because we did, in fact, receive quite a range of feedback. So we did, at the highest level, look at the majority of feedback. On the other hand, if you look at the responses, the vast majority on every criteria suggested that we not change the definition at all. So in a sense, we did override majority rule in making any changes to the definitions. And that reflected the fact that we felt that the criteria did need to be changed and updated, and that if we did not make changes to the original definitions, we would not achieve that goal of improving understanding and use of the criteria for better evaluation. So in that sense, we did go with the majority, but we overruled in some sense on these issues because we did make changes. I think it perhaps would have been possible to just simply say, we've looked into it and we think these criteria are fine, no changes needed, based on the feedback that we received from the public consultation. But in that case, the in-person and the expert-based interviews that we had, I think, were much more influential, because what we saw is that, yes, the criteria are good as they are, but they could be better. And so that's what led to us actually revisiting the original definitions. At the end of the day, we couldn't please everybody, but we tried to be open to good ideas coming from anyone. So we were not bound by whether or not you were an OECD DAC member or not in terms of taking on board suggestions and input, but it was a consensus-based process. The OECD is a consensus-based organization. So I can tell you I have quite a few gray hairs from trying to manage the building up of that consensus, because at the end of the day, we can't go by majority rules. And we actually did have to have quite a broad consensus across our own membership, which is broadly representative of at least part of the international evaluation community. Do you have a couple of other questions then?
Probably a couple of questions revolved around the whether you considered evaluation in the context of an emergency response or humanitarian, and to what extent this was reflected, because in fact, a couple of participants alluded to the fact that the DAC criteria were designed originally for a development program, and the question is, how are they used in the humanitarian context? I presume this might be something that would emerge in the next couple of slides, probably, unless you want to address it now.
Yes, in fact, that will come out in the next set of set of slides. Yeah. Just to address also the overloading question, I think really what I meant with that was simply that we don't think these criteria or these new definitions can fix everything, either in the field of evaluation or more broadly in terms of the state of the planet, the state of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So we are trying to focus a bit on the content to be clear on improving these definitions and supporting their use with better guidance. But we are also neither attempting nor do we want to be judged upon, really fixing all the challenges. So, for example, around evaluation methodologies, there's a lot of more work that needs to be done around evaluation methods. Also on the uptake and the use of evaluation findings, which somebody mentioned in their question as well. These are hugely important issues that we are working on. We do have a guidance, and it's a topic, the question of how do you build in management response systems, how do you strengthen institutional learning, how do you create cultures that allow for evaluative thinking throughout the program cycle. These are all important issues that we and many others work on all the time. And so that's partly what we mean by not overloading, is that let's also, keep the criteria within the focus because that's our current project, but let's also not forget these other important areas.
Great. Before we proceed into the next couple of slides, a couple of questions were revolving around the fact that so many stakeholders were involved in the consultation process. Have you noticed probably any trend among stakeholders? What's your take in terms of the interest of different stakeholders? Were there kind of differences among them in terms of prioritizing criteria vis-a-vis the other? So what's the kind of landscape of the feedback received by stakeholders by discipline or probably by area of concern?
Yes, so there is a report on our website from the consultant Julia Betts, who helped manage that consultation process. And I think that provides at least some insight into this question of different viewpoints and how different perspectives within the evaluation community shaped the feedback that was received. I'm not sure that I could speak to whether consultants were disproportionately represented in the feedback. I think not. Also because consultants have the challenge of evaluating these criteria because they are mandated by institutions that are commissioning evaluations. So I think there's a dynamic interface between consultants and independent providers of evaluative research and the commissioning agencies. So our membership, of course, does represent mainly commissioning agencies, but most of our members also conducted consultations with civil society organizations, with academia, and with policy and strategy colleagues within their institutions. So even through our own membership, we really did try to reach out to get a broader perspective. We haven't analyzed that in depth, though, to that extent to be able to say whether there was a really specific trend in terms of the feedback.
Gotcha.
We probably saw more variety within each of those groups than we did across. So even, you have donor representatives that were saying the same thing as partner country representatives and a private consultant. And then you have other donor representatives that are saying quite different things that also a private consultant is agreeing with. So I would say there were more ideological camps than there were types of feedback providers.
Gotcha. So probably if you go through the next couple of slides, meanwhile, I'll make sure that you wouldn't imagine how much, we're overloaded with questions. So I'll spend the next 10 to 15 minutes probably looking at the questions, try to compile them together so that I can help you better addressing them in the next Q&A session. So Megan, the floor is yours. Back to you. Walk us through the next couple of slides.
Excellent. Thank you, Kasim, and thank you for compiling those. So now turning to the adapted criteria. We have two objectives with these new definitions and principles for use. The first is improving clarity. So we have adjusted and improved the definitions for the original 5 criteria. We have added notes to provide additional explanation of the concepts and the vocabulary that's used in the definitions. And we, at the same time, have attempted to keep the document as short and as easily understood and communicated as possible. We have added one major new criterion, the criterion of coherence, and this reflects the integrated nature of sustainable development, the need for understanding interventions within complex systems, and also the competing policy agendas that we are starting to see. So the competition between climate agenda and development agenda, or poverty reduction and equality, all of these issues that we feel have not sufficiently been addressed through evaluation and need more attention. And that's the purpose of adding the criteria of coherence. We feel that the new criteria are better responsive to equity, gender equality, and women's empowerment, and the Leave No One Behind agenda. And I will give some examples of that as we walk through the 6 criteria and their definitions. At the same time, we are not we are maintaining the criteria at a high level because we know that policy priorities will change. And we believe that the criteria should continue to be relevant to a variety of different actors as policy priorities shift and change. So, for example, you will not see specific current policy priorities, such as reducing carbon pollution. Those are not considered to be criteria, but rather to be the policies around which we are and the goals around which we are evaluating interventions. A couple of quick points on language and scope, and this will address a couple of the questions you mentioned. The first is that we're using the word intervention throughout the document. Now, intervention is not a great word. It's quite clunky and technical in English, and it also sounds even worse in some other languages, but it's the one term that we felt was neutral enough to capture all of the different subjects of evaluation. Projects, programs, policies, strategies. We also evaluate institutions. We evaluate thematic areas, financing mechanisms, etc. So the intention was shifting from project evaluation, which was the focus of the OECD DAC and evaluators in the 70s and 80s, really now to looking at other types of evaluation and other subjects of evaluation. The criteria can be used and are used to evaluate international cooperation activities, but they can also be used to evaluate private sector, NGO, and also local or national governments within their own policy context. So the efforts of cities to reduce carbon pollution, for example, or countries to evaluate their own national health policies. So that's just a word on then the language around intervention. We are also continuing to use the word beneficiaries, and beneficiaries is defined as individuals, groups, or organizations, whether targeted or not, that benefit directly or indirectly from the intervention. Now, we know that the word beneficiaries is uncomfortable for some people, and that's partly because it has been used to connote a passive recipient role for people who are affected by development cooperation or by public policies more generally. That's not our intention of using the word here. We're using it with a specific meaning related to those people or institutions that are meant to benefit from the intervention being evaluated. So while we continue to use the word beneficiaries here and to define it in this way with the hopes that we can convey that meaning, we also recognize that others may want to use different terms such as rights holders, and that may be more appropriate for their own evaluations in their own context. And finally, as I mentioned, we do have notes within the definitions, and these are considered to be parts of the definitions. The document, which you can find at oe.cd/criteria, also has extensive explanations of what changes have been made and provides the original definitions for the first 5 criteria. So diving now into the criteria, we view the criteria as lenses. Each of the 6 criteria gives us a different perspective. So we can imagine it as viewing it through different lenses, looking at its implementation, the process through which the intervention is proceeding, and its results. The 6 criteria, therefore, each provide a different view, and together they provide a much more complete picture of the intervention. I will now go through each of the 6 criteria and provide you with several highlights for each, focused on the areas that I think have emerged through our discussions and our consultations as being the most significant and the most meaningful. There are a number of other points that could be made on each one, though, so I do invite you to look at the full document when you have a chance. Relevance is the first criteria, and it's placed first because it's often looked at the design phase, though it can be looked at throughout the project cycle. Is the intervention doing the right things? Relevance is the extent to which the intervention objectives and design respond to beneficiaries, global, country, and partner needs, policies, and priorities, and continue to do so if circumstances change. Now, relevance has often been called the throwaway criteria, and we feel that relevance could actually be a much more powerful criteria if it's evaluated better. And so our goal with making these changes to this criteria was to strengthen and sharpen the evaluative analysis of relevance. We have added, in addition to objectives, design, and that looks at the theory of change or the intervention logic. Is it also responsive to the context and to the beneficiaries, not just the objectives? In the past, it was viewed that relevance was really viewed through a donor-centric perspective as a one-shot picture of the relevance vis-a-vis donor policies. So our intention with this is to drive a broadening of that focus and a sharpening of the analysis. The second point I'd like to highlight in this definition is the inclusion of beneficiaries as the first in the list of stakeholders to whom an intervention should be relevant. Also, the use of the plural in beneficiaries. And this is recognizing that beneficiaries are not a homogeneous group, and in particular that certain beneficiaries are systematically excluded from the policy's determination process and the determining of priorities. So when we look at policies and priorities that have been defined, for example, by national governments, we know that those do not necessarily reflect adequately all of the beneficiaries or the potential beneficiaries' priorities and needs. So we need to have this perspective of beneficiaries and the multiple beneficiary needs that might need to be addressed. Finally, we have put the word priorities here, needs, policies, and priorities applied to all of the stakeholders. We know, especially in relation to the SDGs, that there are multiple needs for all stakeholders in every context, and that the question of priorities also needs to be addressed. And that's not just for governments or for donor actors to determine what the priorities are, but really beneficiaries also need to be in the driver's seat for that work. And finally, we've added this point of changing circumstances, making the time dimension more explicit. As I said, we want to move away from a one-off ex-ante analysis of relevance. Given that we are working in complex dynamic contexts, we need to continue to revisit relevance. To give one example, in settings of conflict, you often have a conflict analysis that's carried out looking at key drivers of conflict and fragility during the design phase of an intervention. However, those drivers are likely to change over the course of implementation, and interventions need to be responsive to those changing circumstances. Finally, to highlight two other points. One is that we're flagging that relevance and the context is multidimensional. We give some specific instructions on what aspects of the context should be analyzed when we're looking at relevance. And we flag that there are likely to be differences and potentially conflicts between different stakeholders' priorities and needs, and that evaluation should weigh in on these differences and provide evaluative analysis that can help us arbitrate those differences and trade-offs. Once we've looked at relevance, which is really focused on a single intervention, we then turn to a broader picture, which is around coherence and how well that intervention fits with other interventions in a given context within a country, a sector, or an institution. The extent to which this intervention, especially policies, particularly policies, support or undermine the intervention and vice versa. Now, coherence is about compatibility between interventions. That's why I mentioned relevance. We're looking at one intervention. Coherence now looks between that intervention and others. This includes two separate dimensions, one around internal coherence. Now, internal coherence is about synergies and linkages across policy areas. And it's also about international norms and standards. And now, so we're looking within one institutional context. Here, we're looking at issues such as, is a roads intervention, so new infrastructure to build roads, is that compatible and coherent with climate commitments that have been made by the stakeholders involved in building those roads? In terms of international norms and standards, I think this is quite an interesting addition to the coherence criteria, even as it's used currently by some humanitarian actors. And that is about the compatibility between norms and standards to which an institution or government has already signed up or adheres. So there we might say, for example, if we're evaluating the national education policy of Nigeria, to what extent does that national policy, is it aligned with the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the priorities of Nigeria vis-a-vis its progress on the Convention of the Rights of the Child? That's different from looking at whether a particular education intervention is relevant to Nigeria's national education goals and education policy, which we would look at under relevance. Again, we are trying to encourage a deeper analysis here, and we think that by separating coherence from relevance, we can support better evaluation of both topics. Qasim, would you like me to pause here and take any questions, or shall I continue through the other 4 criteria? I recognize it's quite a lot of material.
Well, indeed, it's quite a lot, and I think we have a couple of questions there, so probably we can pause here for 5 to 7 minutes and try to get some. Quickly, a couple of questions revolve around a question on the how. What do you think the role of the local communities where evaluation is applied, in a sense that with the DAC criteria, the premises were set by outside agencies who influence the use and the users of the evaluation, and what's your reaction to that? Another question pertaining to how robust is the DAC criteria in evaluating complex human rights programs, as well as especially in emergency response and humanitarian context? And the third question on the relevance, how would relevance continue? How would relevance as a criteria continues to be? I mean, how is it addressed if circumstances changes? And the question here revolves around the fact that usually relevance is referred to or is accounted for during the planning stage. With the changes in the project, then it might become obsolete. So, what's your take vis-a-vis relevance in a dynamic context? How would you perceive that? If you quickly address those, and then I can get another round of questions.
Great, thank you for that. I'll take the last one first. So this challenge around changing context is exactly why we've made the changes that we have to the relevance definition. So you see here, continue to do so if circumstances change. That is drawing evaluators' attention to the need to revisit relevance, and that what once was considered a relevant project may no longer be relevant, or vice versa. You might have designed an intervention that was not very relevant at the outset, but circumstances changed and made it more relevant. So yes, that is a critically important issue. We've made the point also that all 6 of the criteria can be evaluated at any stage, ex ante, during implementation, or ex post. So even sustainability, for example, and this will start to touch on the first question about involvement of local communities. Sustainability is often described as being only evaluated after the intervention has been implemented. But actually, we have a lot of evidence about what is required to make interventions' benefits be sustained. For example, having local capacities, having consultation and involvement of local communities in designing interventions are critical factors in the sustainability. And so that can be examined before an intervention is even begun. And so the same for relevance. We think if you're doing a midterm review or a final evaluation, you can also continue to look at relevance. And depending on how the circumstances have changed, perhaps there's not been a significant change in the circumstance, and therefore you choose to focus your evaluative analysis on other topics. That will speak to sort of the prioritization, which is something we'll come back to when I talk about the principles for using these criteria. Around the involvement of local communities and the sort of ownership and participation, you are right that the power dynamics that influence what types of interventions or development policies get funded also influence what gets evaluated. We think this is a very important area, and we are working to support evaluations that are owned and led by local impacted communities and national governments. So we think, it's gone are the days where donors should be focused on evaluation only for donor accountability purposes. We think that skewing in evaluation is undermining evaluation's potential to contribute to good democratic governance and processes in all of our countries. So I very much share your concern about the need for local communities to be evaluating the interventions or the activities that are taking place in their own local context. And I think we have a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of both supporting and funding those types of evaluations more actively to overcome the past bias around donor-driven and accountability-driven evaluations that did not sufficiently respond to local needs and local interests. In terms of human rights, complex human rights interventions and humanitarian emergencies, The question was, are these criteria robust for those types of interventions? And I think there are a whole suite of both logistical and methodological challenges, as well as political challenges related to carrying out evaluations of complex and human rights focused interventions. I think these criteria, if they are applied thoughtfully and in a way that is reflective of the complexity of the intervention that's being evaluated, I do think these criteria can be used for those types of evaluations. I think the tools are probably only as good as the way they're being used. So just as really good criteria could be used to do a really bad evaluation, I think really bad criteria could even be used to do a good evaluation. So I think in terms of how well we can evaluate in those settings and how useful and robust evaluation findings might be, I think that depends not only on the criteria that are used, but on a lot of other factors as well. So perhaps I'll turn now then to effectiveness.
Yep, go ahead.
Yep. Okay, so when we've looked at relevance and coherence, the next question is effectiveness. How well have we done on achieving the objectives? Now, this is the most widely evaluated criteria, and there have been several meta-analyses, including recently by ALNAP, who looked also at humanitarian evaluations, that effectiveness is the most commonly used criteria. Even in contexts where the criteria of coherence, coordination, etc., are included in evaluation terms of reference, it's effectiveness that's most often and most likely to be evaluated. It's also viewed as quite a simple, clear criteria, and so we were asked to please not muddle this criteria as we adjusted the definition. I would just highlight one major change to the effectiveness criteria, and I think it's really quite significant. And that is, effectiveness is defined as the extent to which the intervention achieved or is expected to achieve its objectives and its results, including any differential results across groups. Now, this focus on differential results, of course, reflects the equity agenda and the leave no one behind agenda and imperative. I think this is really significant because it opens the door for evaluations to ask questions about differential results, even if equity was not an objective of the intervention when it was designed. And that's quite significant because that puts evaluators in a much stronger position to look at differential results and look at equity in a serious way when they're evaluating effectiveness. Once we've looked at what has been achieved by the intervention, we can then look at how well the inputs, the resources were used to achieve that. And that's the question of efficiency. Again, efficiency, similar to relevance, is one that is not very well evaluated in many cases, and we would like to see better evaluation of efficiency. It's the extent to which the intervention delivers or is likely to deliver results in an economic and timely way. Now, we've defined efficiency as being the relation between input, funds, expertise, natural resources, time, as they are converted to outputs and outcomes, so through the entire results chain. Now, this is an area that we recognize that there are a lot of methodological and data challenges that make it difficult to evaluate, for example, inputs as converted to outcomes and impact in particular, but we think this is an area of high importance, and so we don't want to rule it out, and we have defined efficiency to cover the entire results chain. I'm showing here a visual from Mokoro, which I think is quite useful, and that's actually from a paper that they've done on efficiency analysis, which I invite you to look up because it's quite useful and helpful on looking at how efficiency is evaluated. We've also added the dimension of the timeliness of the intervention. So, for example, we see comparative analysis of infrastructure projects and how long they took to be delivered. We think this issues around operational efficiency and how well an intervention was managed are really critical and should be evaluated better. Turning from efficiency then to impact. Impact really looks at the so what. What difference is the intervention making? And I think impact throughout the consultation process was perhaps the most contested and the most changed in terms of the outcome. So looking at the definition now is the extent to which the intervention has generated or is expected to generate significant positive or negative, intended or unintended, higher level effects. Impact addresses the ultimate significance and potentially transformative effects of the intervention. It seeks to identify social, environmental, and economic effects of the intervention that are longer term or broader in scope than those already captured under the effectiveness criterion. Now, during the consultations, we heard that often people confuse impact as a criterion with impact evaluation, as in randomized control trials or other attribution-focused evaluations. There was not strong support for defining impact in that narrow way as being statistically significant changes. Instead, the consensus was that impact should really be about the higher level effects, the effects that really matter to people, to the planet. And so this is where we've chosen to focus the definition. We also think it's very important to flag this issue around the potential transformative effects of the intervention, which we've defined here as being holistic and enduring changes in systems or norms. So this really gets at the question of, you may have achieved your objectives, you may have done so in a very efficient way, but you have not addressed the systemic issues that are creating a problem, for example, by not addressing root causes or root drivers. So these issues around the ultimate significance and the transformative effects are really important. I would also like to flag the continued inclusion of unintended effects. Now, we know from various studies that we've done that unintended effects are really neglected, and we think this is another area where evaluation should continue to focus. There was a review, for example, of NORAD's evaluations, which showed that in cases where unintended effects were included in the terms of reference, only 1 in 3 evaluations actually looked at unintended effects. And when it was not included in the terms of reference, only 1 in 4 evaluations included any analysis at all of unintended effects. We think in particular, given the critical issues around the climate crisis currently, that looking better at unintended effects and also unintended effects in terms of equity impacts is really critical. And that also includes both positive and negative unexpected effects. Just to flag here that we also think looking at unintended effects is important because it's useful for capturing innovation. So if you don't look outside the box of the intervention as it was conceived, you often miss a lot of local and process-oriented innovations that might have emerged from the intervention. And so the focus on positive, negative, intended or unintended effects is intended to capture that. And finally, sustainability. Will the benefits last? The key issues on sustainability is that the original criteria was viewed as being too donor-centric and focused only on external funding and the ending of external funding. So now we have focused instead on the benefits. Will the benefits of the intervention continue? We've also flagged that sustainability is multidimensional. We've looked at the capacities and the systems that are required to sustain benefits over time. And we've flagged that there are potential risks and trade-offs. So for example, if a health program is financially sustainable for a national government, but it does not enjoy social consensus, you may have some trade-offs between the funding that's required to sustain the benefits of that health program and other social dynamics or social responses to those public policies. That's sustainability. Now I've outlined for you these key definitions. I would like to, before I turn it over again to Qasim for some questions, is just to flag some of the really important messages that have emerged around how to use these definitions and the criteria. As I mentioned during the consultation, one of the key messages was that it's not so much the definitions, but how they're used and misused. So we've tried to address some of the confusion with the improved definitions. We are also in the process now of developing a guidance to support their use and to look at specifically how the criteria are applied to different types of evaluations and in different settings. So that's where we will actually go into much more depth on the application of these criteria, for example, to human rights interventions, to evaluations taking place in settings of conflict and fragility, or to different thematic areas and different partners involved in specific evaluations. We're also really trying to emphasize the need for a thoughtful, adaptive, and prioritized approach, and a more interconnected approach. So some meta-analyses have shown that interventions tend to do well on all criteria or none of the criteria. And so we think there needs to be more dialogue and more cross-analysis looking at the different criteria and weighing them up when making an overall evaluative judgment. So you may have a very effective program in terms of achieving the intended objectives, but if it had unintended negative impacts that were very harmful, that could outweigh the effectiveness. So that needs to be taken into account in a judgment of the evaluation when assessing the overall effectiveness of the intervention. We have two key principles for use, and these are that the criteria can never be a replacement for thoughtful approaches. So we need to use them carefully and thoughtfully. They should be contextualized and understood in the context of the individual evaluation. So the specific focus and the specific interpretation of the criteria might look quite different depending on what is being evaluated and who's involved. And second, and perhaps most importantly, that the criteria are not meant to be a straitjacket. Their use, whether they're evaluated at all, should depend on the purpose of the evaluation. And they should be covered according to the needs of the relevant stakeholders and that context. So while we believe that they do apply to all interventions, they are normative in the sense that we believe all interventions should be relevant, they should be efficiently implemented, they should be effective, and have positive impacts that are sustained. They all apply, but more or less time or no time at all might be devoted in an evaluation to evaluating each of the criteria. So those key principles, I think, are really important, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this new work that's now underway, which I hope you will all get involved in to develop a better guidance to help address some of the issues, including some of the questions that you've already raised. So in this next step, I'll stop there then and turn it back over to you, Qasim.
Thank you again, Begum. I tried to pull in a couple of questions from the sidebar. One of the probably comment or clarifications or questions raised on the sidebar is basically that to what extent you think that these criteria need to be translated for the layperson to understand them? Because to some of those practitioners, it seems that again these criteria are a bit complicated, high level, and the evaluators would need to translate them for the local communities or for the layperson to understand them better. Another comment, how would you combine efficiency and value for money? And there is a reference here to DFID 5E framework. I think this is a bit of specific questions. I don't know to what extent we can address that. A general kind of comment that emerged throughout is that for many of the, there is it seems that for many of us, the practitioners, there is a thinking that the evaluation commissioners take these criteria as a blueprint, as you said, it's a straitjacket, and the blueprint whereby every single criteria will be addressed in every single evaluation. Though you've highlighted the fact that we need not to consider them as a straitjacket. We need to think first about the type of criteria that respond or to correspond better to the evaluation questions, the evaluation to the intervention in the first place. But again, it seems that from a commissioner's standpoint, it's not that clear. I would love for you to address those 3-4 comments, and then I'll do another round of compiling other set of questions.
Great, thank you so much. And you're making it much easier for me, so I do appreciate that, Qasim. I understand there's a lot of comments coming in. So first, on translating them to the layperson, I think this is really critical. And it's something that also speaks to your last point, the last question about sort of the commissioners adopting them as a Bible or a Quran and applying them blindly. So I do think these need to be translated both in the literal sense, linguistically, but also conceptually. And I think, what we've seen is that the basic concepts, are we doing the right things? Are we doing them well? Is it making a difference? These are really quite universal, but the language, you're right, is quite technical language. And so I think we have to be careful and be selective about how we communicate. That's one of the reasons that we've now included these high-level questions whenever we're presenting the criteria definitions, because we think that's very important and it can help in communicating about these criteria. There's also a need for local translation in more of a conceptual sense. So just looking at the OECD countries, for example, in Sweden, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness linguistically does not exist. So in Sweden's evaluation policy, they actually have a note explaining in more depth what the word efficiency means as opposed to effectiveness. And so you have a lot of linguistic but also conceptual differences between cultures and how they understand criteria and what's most important to cover. And I think that we have really a great opportunity right now with these new definitions coming out, but also with the guidance, to really take some time and have those conversations within different countries and within different institutions to translate these and their meaning into locally meaningful criteria. And that's certainly something that we, from within the OECD DAC, we're very supportive of, and we think that will make the criteria all the more useful as they're applied. So we would also love to see any examples that you have of how you are translating them to communicate them to the layperson. At the very least, I could use that to tell my mother what it is that I'm doing all the time. So we would appreciate if you share any examples that you have of where you've been able to successfully communicate these criteria and the new definitions. Around efficiency and value for money, yes, the two terms are often used interchangeably. I won't speak directly to the 5E framework from DFID, but our definition of efficiency looks a little bit more broadly than simply value for money. It brings in the time dimension, but it also looks at other resources. So we do have a definition of economic that's contained within the note on efficiency, and I think that should provide a little bit more clarity on value for money. We do use the term cost effective here, which again, depending on how you're defining value for money, is sometimes used interchangeably. So the reason we didn't use the term value for money here is that we wanted to focus also on the fact that the cheapest option is not necessarily the best. And we felt that this concept of converting inputs into results is better at translating that. And that's particularly important given the Leave No One Behind agenda. So reaching the last, or the people who are furthest behind will likely be much more expensive than reaching the middle class or reaching middle income countries, for example, and helping them achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to be clear that it's not simply the cheapest alternative, but it's what results are you getting and what does that mean in terms of the efficient use of resources. So I hope that answers the question on efficiency and value for money. I think you're right on the commissioner's misuse of the criteria, and what we're doing now is working with our own members who are commissioners of evaluation to support them adapting their own policies, their own guidelines, and their internal instructions for their staff to try to address that concern.
Thank you, Megan, for that. I think we still have another probably 5 to 7 minutes.
Kasim,
yes,
Kasim, may I ask you to get closer to your mic, please? Thank you.
Sure. In fact, I am. I'm trying my best to be as close as possible. So, Ada, correct me if I'm wrong. We still have another 5 to 7 minutes, isn't it?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Again, quickly, I've noticed that throughout the on the sidebar there is a recurrent comment that the criteria, it's a revision of criteria, but it's for so many people they cannot see the main differences. Well, I think from the way you described some of the scoping, I've noticed that you've highlighted a lot of differences at the level of the scope, at the level of the components of the criteria, but probably a quick round of the major difference between the previous set and the current set. That's it seems a lot of our colleagues haven't got that, haven't grasped it, and they would love to see probably a comparative table. Probably, as you alluded earlier, the report on the website might address that.
Yes, so the report does contain the original definitions and the new definitions and explains every change that was made and justifies it. But in a sense, you're right. There has not been a drastic revision of these criteria. And at the conceptual level, relevance still means the same thing. So that does reflect the feedback that we received in the consultation that we should not try to fix something, but the overwhelming majority think that conceptually these 5 criteria, the original 5, we're good, and they're helping us ask the right questions about a whole range of interventions. So you're right in the sense that this is not an overhaul, and this is not chucking it all out and having a completely new approach. So at the basic level, that's true. The changes that have been made to the definitions are to try to improve the analysis and to improve clarity. So that is true. I would say that some of the most significant changes, though, I would say inclusion of differential results and effectiveness is really significant. And I would like to highlight that as being a very important change here. And I think what we don't want to do is kind of have everybody say, oh, they're just the same old thing, and so we just carry on business as usual. What we're trying to message here is that there's a need for change. There's a need to change how we're thinking about these criteria and how we're evaluating them. And so that's what we want to encourage. But I think, there was a lot of hard negotiation to get differential results into effectiveness. And I think it's a huge opportunity for evaluators to really step up on the equity agenda. And so I think that's one that I'd like to highlight. I think also impact is an important change because we're really trying to make a break from this idea of statistically significant interventions being called impact. The idea that you could evaluate a hand washing station as creating a statistically significant increase in hand washing, and that's impact. I think this is really not fit for the times that we're living in. And so the focus and impact of what does this mean for people and the planet, I think is really important as well. And I think again that this new definition for impact will try and help address some of the impact washing and the impact hype that we're seeing in different areas of public policy now. So I'd like to see some more attention on that. So I guess in response to this question of what's different, that's part of it. And then the third area that I'd like to highlight is really this focus on use. So in the previous versions, the fact that they were defined in a glossary where the criteria were sort of sitting out there all by themselves, I think is viewed as quite a weakness. And I think that's part of what led to this mechanistic application and making them mandatory and applying them in ways that were not reflective of broader principles for evaluation. So the embedding of these new definitions within a guidance, I think, will also be a significant change, and the inclusion of more explanation of how they're intended to be used and these principles for use, I think is also significant.
It is, in fact, and I think I'd like to conclude. I'd like you to conclude with a reflection on the use of the revised DAC criteria in the context of the Agenda 2030. And I think this is where you probably want to take us in the next slide, probably. So again, the floor is yours, Megan.
Okay, so
Megan, before you wrap up, may I ask you to please deal with one question from my colleague Michele. He was asking about the importance of unintended results and the fact that it seems that unintended results are not under effectiveness. And given that impact is not a criterion that will be used in most of the evaluations or in many of the evaluations, what about dealing with unintended results in the effectiveness criteria? Over, thank you. Sorry for this intervention, but I thought it was useful.
Yes, thank you, Ada. And
probably, Megan, allow me to apologize for all the participants. Literally, we've been bombarded with a lot of comments, clarification, and questions, and I really apologize. I couldn't take much of those questions, so I apologize for those whom I didn't probably relay their concerns. Again, Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, and I appreciate that, and I apologize as well, and I hope that we do have a frequently asked questions section on our website, so we'll look through the recording and gather some of the questions and try to respond to those as well. You can also send us an email or a direct message on Twitter, and we'll try to respond to those questions. And also, in the spirit of collaboration, we don't have all the answers to all of these questions either. And so really we hope that this is a contribution to help us all collectively move forward in the field of evaluation. And we certainly don't have all the answers, and we also look forward to hearing your own answers to some of these questions. So to address then the point on unintended effects, yes, within effectiveness, we do have, in addition to achievement of objectives, we have the word results. And results is also defined in the glossary as including unintended results. So there is some scope to look at unintended effects, and I think also including differential results opens the door for looking at unintended effects. I think the challenge was that the perception, there was not a strong consensus on that early on, and I think part of it was this idea that effectiveness is simple and let's not confuse it too much. But I do think that when it's interpreted, some will include unintended results under effectiveness, and others will leave it, and then you could also look at higher level unintended results under impact. But I think others will keep more strictly to the definitions as they stand, where unintended results would be looked at only under impact. My hope is also that with these changes and with the suggestion that you don't apply them in a mechanistic manner, but you prioritize the criteria, that we might actually have more evaluations looking at impact. What we've seen is that a lot of times, because of the confusion with impact evaluation, when an intervention could not create a robust counterfactual, they therefore said, let's not look at impact. And I think that's really, you're missing out on a lot with that approach, and there are other methods for looking at impact. And so hopefully we can support a shift away from that type of thinking that leads to impact being quite neglected in terms of not being evaluated. I think also we should look a little bit more at the dynamics around commissioners of evaluation and consultants, and how within that relationship we can support better analysis of unintended effects, because I think they're often left out of terms of reference, and they're often a blind spot for evaluators. So that I think we need to do more to try and think of how we can better capture unintended effects in evaluations, and that's probably goes beyond just these definitions, but is a broader project that we should look into further. So thank you for raising that, Michele. Was there? Oh, then sorry, Kassem. Then you were asking me to just sort of wrap up in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So personally, what I think is one of the most exciting things about Agenda 2030 is the universality, and the fact that it applies to all countries. And all countries are aiming to take efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that light as well, around the climate crisis and the Paris Agreement, no country is on track to meet their commitments. And so evaluation can be applied in a way that helps support all countries on this agenda. We would like to see better use of evaluation in that sense. And I think the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 around equity, leave no one behind, and the universality are really important to take into consideration when we're doing evaluations. So you may not see the Agenda 2030 reflected here in terms of the definitions, and that's because they are meant to be used to evaluate interventions that are aimed at achieving those goals. But in the guidance that's forthcoming, we do plan to include more information on, in particular, how sort of the core principles and values of Agenda 2030 can be reflected in the use of these criteria. And with that, I think I'll wrap up and say thank you to all of you. Thank you for the questions that are coming online, and do please keep in touch with us and let us know what else we can do to support you. And also, good luck with applying these criteria. We do plan to revisit the definitions in 3 years' time. So feel free to also give us feedback on how it's working out as you go about incorporating these into your own work. Our website is OE one more time, and here you have our Twitter handle and our email address that you can reach out to us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you so much for the time and for the exciting and participatory webinar. I think we have a lot of comments, clarification on sidebar that we try to compile and probably also try to start an online discussion through the EVALSDGs and UNICEF platforms. Quickly, I'd love to give the floor to Ada probably for a concluding remark before we end it up. But luckily and happily, guess what? I mean, after an hour and 15 minutes or 20 minutes, we still have 190 participants online, and this is definitely a record for the webinar. Thank you so much again, Megan. Ada, any final notes?
Thank you so much, Kasem. I would like to echo you on thanking the audience we had today, that it's not only large, but it's very diverse, which is important for this discussion. Important to mention that many people have not been able to join because, as Kasem has mentioned, we reached the threshold, which is not usual. We are close to the threshold, but never, it's the second time we go beyond. In all the series of webinars, this means that probably, if Megan agrees, we will consider having another webinar in the future to continue the discussion. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for your patience and understanding that we were not able to take all the questions, but the discussion continues. And as mentioned before, and as mentioned in all the emails we sent for convening these webinars, we will be sharing with you the materials and the recording. Thank you very, very much. And also check from time to time the EVALSDGs website, where you have also access to all the webinars we have done in the past, and we will continue updating that website. On behalf of EVALSDGs, UNICEF, I would like to thank you, Megan, very, very much for her time and contribution. Megan, always a pleasure to work with you. Thank you to your team as well. Thank you, Kasem, for your moderation, and thank you to all the colleagues that have been with us this morning for us, this afternoon for some others, and this evening for some of you as well. Thank you very much. Looking forward to continue working with you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Megan. Bye.